How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday, Yom Shlishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Tuesday? Renee in Indiana, Yehuda in South Carolina, Bella in Florida, Joe in the Inland Empire, Shandor in the Bronx, Lucy in Minnesota, Gail in Kansas City, Melissa in Great Neck, Bell in Texas, Lorraine in Texas, Lester in Florida, Moshe in Brooklyn, Elise in Virginia, Lynn in Canada, Nancy in North Carolina, Marie in Freeport, and Chaim in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Tonight's class is sponsored by my dear friend Chaim Marks in memory of his father, Nachum ben Nachum. May the neshama have an aliyah. We say amen. And Chaim, thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. In the merit of that, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings, and may your business prosper beyond all imagination, even your ample imagination. We say amen. Okay, we're right at the top of page 25a. Our daf tonight is page 25 here in Tractate Menachot, the 30th volume of the Talmud. Continuing our journey through chapter 3. Tonight we will open and complete, God willing, Mishna number 5 and Mishna number 6. Okay, Mishnah 5 of chapter 3, right at the top of 25a. If the handful that is removed from a meal offering, it's the handful that's going to be burned on the altar after we add salt and frankincense to it, that will permit the remainder of the meal offering to be eaten. If the handful became tameh, ritually impure, and despite this, the priest sacrificed it, which of course is to tell you that if the meal offering became tameh, even after the handful was removed, the handful should not be burned on the altar. But if it was burned anyway, after the fact, then the tzitz, the front plate, the golden front plate worn by the high priest, which says holy to Hashem on it. This is all when the temple was standing in Jerusalem. Hasn't been done in 2,000 years, but this is the law. If the handful became tameh, and despite this, the priest sacrificed it, the tzitz of the high priest affects acceptance of the meal offering, and therefore the remainder is eaten by the priests, right? So if it became tameh, it should not be sacrificed, and then of course the remainder would not be eaten. But if it was sacrificed anyway, and we'll hear some more of the particulars on that in the Gemara, then because the problem with it was that the offering had become tameh, ritually impure, for that issue, the tzitz atones and allows that offering to be accepted, and therefore the owner of that offering fulfilled his obligation, and the priest may eat the remainder. However, if the handful, after it was removed from the meal offering, left its designated area, like it left the courtyard of the temple, and despite this, the priest then sacrificed it, in that situation, the tzitz does not affect acceptance. And the reason is that the tzitz affects acceptance for offerings that are sacrificed when tameh, and it does not affect acceptance for offerings that leave the designated area. That's Mishnah 5. Now the Gemara. As I get older, even though the glasses are bifocal, or whatever it's called, transitional, it's basically bifocals, but I just see better for reading without the glasses on, at least for now. Now, Gemara, the sages taught in a baraisa, it is written with regard to the tzitz, and it shall be upon Aaron's forehead, and Aaron shall bear the sin committed with the sacred items, which the children of Israel shall hallow, even all their sacred gifts, and it shall be always upon his forehead, that they may be accepted before the Lord. Right? So that's Exodus 28:38. Now that tells you that the tzitz consecrates something that otherwise should not be consecrated, right? It's going to affect acceptance of something that shouldn't have been brought on the altar. And the sages interpret that the type of error, right, the type of sin, basically, because it should not have been brought on the altar, but it was anyway, that is atoned for, that the acceptance is affected, despite the fact that it shouldn't have been offered, is offerings that have become tameh. How do we know that? Why doesn't it affect acceptance of other types of flawed offerings? Right? In this passage, do we see that it says anything about tameh items? Again, and it shall be upon Aaron's forehead, and Aaron shall bear the sin committed with the sacred items, which the children of Israel shall hallow, even all their sacred gifts, and it shall be always upon his forehead, that they may be accepted before the Lord. So why is it that it's tameh offerings that the tzitz will atone for and create acceptance for, but not other kinds of flawed offerings? So the sages expounded, but which sin does he bear? If you say he atones for the sin of piggul, well, right? So where the priest who was bringing that offering, either removing the handful or slaughtering an animal offering or collecting the blood, etc., with intention to eat of the edible portion beyond its deadline, that would have rendered it piggul. It does not affect acceptance for piggul. And how do we know that? Right? But which sin does he bear? If you say he atones for the sin of piggul, it is already stated, it shall not be credited to him in Leviticus 7:18. And if you say he atones for the sin of notar, that which is left beyond the deadline, even though there wasn't an original intent to do that, that is already stated in the same verse. It shall not be accepted. So evidently the high priest wearing the tzitz bears only the sin of tumah, right? Ritual impurity in the offering of an individual. The tzitz is understood to atone for the sin of sacrificing an offering that is tameh, as its general prohibition was permitted in certain circumstances, right? Offerings that have become tameh, their sacrificial portion shall not be brought on the altar. But we already have an exception to that that's defined in the Torah, that if the majority of the population are tameh, or if all the priests are tameh, then we're going to bring that offering anyway, right? They're going to bring communal offerings anyway. We're not going to bring individual offerings of people that are tameh or by priests that are tameh. But for communal offerings, when the majority of the community or majority of the priests are tameh, then we override the prohibition on tumah. And so there we have an opening to say, oh, well, this must be what the tzitz is atoning for. Individual offerings that should have been brought but are brought anyway, while tameh, that's what it atones for. Now, Rabbi Zera objects to this line of reasoning. He says, why not say that the tzitz atones for the sin of sacrificing offerings that leave the courtyard and are thereby disqualified, as its general prohibition was permitted in certain circumstances. Specifically, in the case of an offering that was sacrificed on a private altar during the period after the Jewish people had entered the land of Israel and before there was an established location for the tabernacle. So it's that brief time, 14 years, when the children of Israel first went into the land. They didn't have a location designated yet for the national altar. Offerings of individuals could be brought on private altars, so therefore not on the national altar. And that was a time when there was an exception created that offerings could be brought up on private altars, meaning they left, right? These offerings were not brought in the designated area, the national altar. So why not learn out from that time of exception that the tzitz could atone for offerings that were brought outside their designated area? That was Rabbi Zera's question. Abaye said to him, the verse states with regard to the tzitz, and it shall be always upon his forehead, that they may be accepted before the Lord, teaching that in the case of a sin whose general prohibition is permitted before the Lord, i.e. in the temple or in the courtyard of the tabernacle, yes, the front plate atones for it. But in the case of the sin offerings that leave the courtyard, whose general prohibition is not permitted before the Lord, the front plate, the tzitz, does not atone for it. Rabbi Eli objects to this. Why not say that the tzitz atones for the sin of performing the service using one's left hand instead of one's right, which would also disqualify an offering? As its general prohibition was permitted in certain circumstances, right? You're saying that the reason that the tzitz atones for offerings that are tameh is because in certain circumstances, tameh offerings are accepted. Well, offerings brought with the left hand, that's accepted in certain circumstances, namely on Yom Kippur. Now, there's a reason for that. The high priest, when he enters the Holy of Holies, he's got both of his hands full. Right, he's carrying the ladle with the coals of fire and the ladle with the incense and a pan, the shovel with the hot burning coals. He's going to need to mix those things together in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. So he's got to carry something, and I think it's the ladle with the incense in it in his left hand. Right, in certain circumstances, specifically in the case of Yom Kippur, when the high priest carries the spoon bearing the incense into the Holy of Holies with his left hand. Abaye said to him, the verse states, and Aaron shall bear the sin committed with the sacred items, to say that the tzitz atones for a sin that was committed with the offering, and I deferred it. This serves to exclude the spoon bearing the incense of Yom Kippur, where there is no sin that was deferred, since its proper performance is for the high priest to hold it with his left hand, as he must hold both the coal pan and the spoon of incense. Right? That's a situation where it was being done correctly, not that an exception was being made. Rav Ashi said the front plate does not atone for the sin of sacrificing an offering with the left hand for a different reason. The verse states, and Aaron shall bear the sin committed with the sacred items, hakodashim, demonstrating that the front plate atones for a sin inherent in the offering itself, and not for a sin committed by those who bring the offering. Rav Sima, the son of Rav Idi, said to Rav Ashi, and some say that it was Rav Sima, the son of Rav Ashi, who said to Rav Ashi, but why not say that the front plate atones for the sin of a blemished animal? Right? A blemished animal cannot be brought as an offering. If it was brought anyway, perhaps the front plate atones for that. Why would we think that? As its general prohibition was permitted in certain circumstances, specifically in the case of birds. The law of a blemish disqualifying an offering only applies to mammals. All right, oxen, sheep, and goats brought as offerings, not to birds brought as offerings. As the master says, the law that an offering must be unblemished and the law that a burnt offering must be male are taught with regard to animal offerings, meaning mammals. But there is no requirement that an offering must be unblemished and male with regard to birds. So why not say that if a blemished animal was brought despite the prohibition, then the tzitz would atone for that flaw in the offering, and it would be accepted. Why not say that? Rav Ashi said to him, with regard to your claim, the verse states about blemished animals, it shall not be accepted. But whatsoever has a blemish, that you shall not bring, for it shall not be acceptable for you. Teaching that in no case are blemished animals accepted as offerings, even due to the tzitz. So there's a prohibition written into the Torah that would prevent that sort of analysis that would result in the tzitz atoning for and affecting acceptance of a blemished animal, a blemished mammal, and so we can't apply to that. And so basically, by process of elimination, the only kind of flaw that the tzitz could atone for is tameh offerings that became ritually impure during the process and that were brought anyway. The tzitz would atone for that. Weiter. Onward, next topic. The sages taught in the Baraisa, in the case of blood of an offering that became tameh, right? So the animal was slaughtered at the time of the slaughter of the ox, the sheep, the goat, etc., which could be done by a non-priest, but a priest was there with a service vessel to receive the blood of the soul when that animal was slaughtered. And then he's going to convey that blood to the altar and sprinkle some drops of that blood on the altar, which is the principal mode of acceptance of the animal offering that's being brought. Okay. But if that blood became tameh, right? An animal cannot become tameh, but after it's been slaughtered, the meat could become tameh and the blood could become tameh. And in either case, if it became tameh, then the blood should not be presented on the altar. But if it was presented on the altar, the tzitz would atone for it and effect acceptance of that offering after the fact. But as we shall see, like I said, it shouldn't be done, but if it was done, it will affect atonement. So what does this mean? It shouldn't be done, but if it was done, meaning if it was done unwittingly. If they knew it was tameh and they brought it anyway, intentionally, then the tzitz would not atone for that flaw in the process, right? The sages taught in the Baraisa, in the case of blood of an offering that became tameh and a priest sprinkled it on the altar, if he did so unwittingly, the offering is accepted and affects atonement for the owner of the offering. If he sprinkled the blood intentionally, the offering is not accepted. In what case is this statement said? In the case of the offering of an individual. But in the case of a communal offering, right? Offerings brought on behalf of the whole population. But in the case of communal offering, whether he sprinkled the blood unwittingly or whether he did so intentionally, the offering is accepted. And in the case of an offering of a non-Jew, where the blood of the offering became tameh, whether the priest sprinkled the blood unwittingly or whether he did so intentionally, whether he did so due to circumstances beyond his control or whether he did so willingly, the offering is not accepted. As the verse states with regard to the tzitz, that it may be accepted for them before the Lord, with the term for them, teaching that this is for them, for the community of the high priest. He's not a high priest on behalf of the whole world. He's the high priest on behalf of the children of Israel. So a tameh offering should not be brought. If it was brought unwittingly on behalf of an individual, the tzitz will atone for it. If it was brought for any reason on behalf of the whole community, the tzitz will atone for it. If it was brought tameh for any reason at all, whether intentionally or unintentionally, on behalf of non-Jews, the tzitz will not atone for it. And since the tzitz won't atone for it, it does not affect acceptance. And that if that non-Jew who was bringing an offering to the Holy Temple, which was possible, right? Non-Jews could bring animal offerings to the Holy Temple. I believe they were burnt offerings when they were brought. If somehow along the way it became tameh, which is a very rare thing, it's very unlikely to happen. There was very little tuma inside the Holy Temple for obvious reasons. This would only really happen, for example, if a priest dropped dead, while he was serving in the temple. So if that happened and he came into contact with the offering or with the blood of the offering of a non-Jew, so he would have to bring another offering because this would not affect acceptance. That and by the way, that's normally what would have to be done for a Jew also, because it would only be if they found out afterwards that it came into contact, and so it was brought unwittingly. But if somebody dropped dead in the temple and came into contact with the blood and they knew it, they could not bring that offering. They could not sprinkle that blood unless it was a communal offering. Okay, now we're on page 25b. And the Gemara raised a contradiction from another baraisa. For what does the front plate worn by the high priest, the tzitz, effect acceptance? It affects acceptance for the blood, for the flesh, and for the fat of an offering that became tameh in the temple, whether they were rendered tameh unwittingly or intentionally, whether due to circumstances beyond one's control or willfully, whether in the case of the offering of an individual or in the case of a communal offering. Right? So now, remember, one thing is in terms of intentionality, whether an offering that became tameh and then, was the blood sprinkled on the altar wittingly or unwittingly, willingly or unwillingly, etc. That's one question, right? And we've just answered that before. Now we're talking about how did the offering become tameh, right? How did the offering become tameh? The living animal can't become tameh. So after it was slaughtered, either the flesh, either the animal itself, the meat of that animal, once it was slaughtered, either that became tameh or the blood became tameh. How did it happen? Could it happen intentionally or unintentionally, willingly, unwillingly, wittingly, unwittingly, etc.? That's how it became tameh. Then it's a different question. At the time that the blood was sprinkled on the altar, did the priest who was doing that know that the blood or the animal that it came from had become tameh? So no matter how the animal became tameh in terms of intentionality, if its blood was sprinkled on the altar, let's say by a different priest, unwittingly, not knowing that it had become tameh, the tzitz will atone for that. Or if it was a communal offering, even if it did so intentionally, the tzitz will atone for that. Now, Rav Yosef said, what's the question? Yeah, right. And Rav Yosef said, this is not difficult. So that law that we just learned from a baraisa was raised as a contradiction, talking about that it doesn't matter whether it's willing or unwilling. So Rav Yosef explains, this is not difficult. This baraisa, which teaches that the tzitz affects acceptance for impure blood of an individual offering that was sprinkled intentionally, is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef. Whereas that baraisa, which teaches that the front plate does not affect acceptance, is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. As it is taught in a baraisa, one may not separate teruma from tameh produce for tahor, ritually pure produce. And if he separated teruma from impure produce unwittingly, his teruma is considered teruma. But if he did so intentionally, the sages penalize him and his teruma is not teruma. And Rabbi Yosef says whether he did so unwittingly or intentionally, his teruma is teruma. Like the ruling found in the second baraisa, Rabbi Yosef does not distinguish between a case where one acted unwittingly and where one acted intentionally. Now, I thought a distinction was being made about how it became tameh and then what the priest did. But I'm not sure that I had the distinction correctly. But here we're looking at something a little bit differently. We're looking at teruma, right? So teruma, when there's different kinds of teruma. When teruma is unspecified, it generally refers to teruma gedola, which means that when the temple was standing and people were farming in the land of Israel, they harvested the produce. Okay, the very beginning of the produce would be the first fruits, bikurim. And after that comes 2% of the produce that would be set aside and given to a priest. And the owner of the produce could choose which priest he was going to give it to. And the produce had to be tahor. And as he pulled the teruma out of it, the person doing that has to be tahor, so that the teruma is not rendered tameh. And then it's given to a priest in a state of tahara, a state of ritual purity. And then the priest will have to eat it at the time that when he gets around to eating it, where both the teruma and the priest himself and the members of his household who are also permitted to eat it, everybody has to be tahor, ritually pure. The teruma must be tahor, the priest must be tahor, and the members of his household have to be tahor when they're consuming teruma. If if they violate that prohibition, then that's a karas-bearing penalty, death at the hands of the heavenly court. Now, if somehow the teruma becomes tameh, so the priest can't eat it, right? It's still his, and interestingly enough, so what can he do with it? It has to be destroyed, right? You can't sell tameh teruma. In order, like, just say, oh, okay, well, non-priests, non-priests can eat food that is tameh. We do it all the time. But teruma can only be consumed by priests and can only be consumed when both the teruma and the priests are tahor. So if the teruma becomes tameh, what does the priest do? He has to destroy it. But what's interesting is he can benefit from the destruction of the teruma. So, for example, if oil that could have been used for eating became tameh, it can still be burned, and its burning can be in the form of a lantern. Like it can be like a wick in a lantern, in a light, can be used to illuminate the house. He just can't consume it while it is tameh, but he can benefit from its destruction. Okay. So here we're talking about, so the proper way to handle teruma is that the owner has to separate the teruma, right, from tahor produce. It has to, a tahor person keeping the teruma tahor, turning it over to the priest, has to be guarded so it remains tahor, and then the priest and his family have to be themselves tahor when they consume it. But if it becomes tameh along the way, it's a problem. Okay, that can happen, obviously, unwittingly, accidentally. No one did it on purpose, but then we have to deal with it. All right, so let's read that again. It's Tana Baraisa. One may not separate teruma from ritually impure produce for ritually pure produce. Now remember that until produce is tithed, the owner of the produce can't benefit from it. He can't eat it, he can't sell it. So, in order to render his own produce edible, he has to make sure to separate teruma. But what if all his produce became tameh? Now, he can still eat it, but he can't tithe it because he can't separate teruma from ritually impure produce. So what's he going to do? So if he separated teruma from impure produce unwittingly, okay, then his teruma is considered teruma. It can be given to a priest. The priest is still going to have to destroy it. He can't eat it, but the tithing is considered correct as long as when he separated teruma from impure produce, he did that unwittingly. But if he did so intentionally, the sages penalize him and his teruma is not teruma. Rabbi Yosei says, whether he did so unwittingly or intentionally, his teruma is teruma. Minority opinion. So like the ruling found in the second Baraisa, Rabbi Yosei does not distinguish between a case where one acted unwittingly and where one acted intentionally. Now the Gemara objects to this comparison about tuma in offerings compared to tuma in produce in the teruma process. You can say that you heard that Rabbi Yosei holds that the sages do not penalize him. Did you hear him say, as the Baraisa teaches, that the tzitz, the front plate, affects acceptance for the tuma of the portions of offerings that are to be eaten? But isn't it Tana Baraisa that Rabbi Eliezer says the tzitz affects acceptance for the tuma of the portions of offerings that are to be eaten? That's Rabbi Eliezer's view. Rabbi Yosei says the tzitz does not affect acceptance for the impurity of portions of offerings that are to be eaten. Right? See, here they're talking about if let's say there was a meal offering, the handful was separated, then then the remainder became tameh. At that point, the handful should not be burned. But let's say that the priest who's burning the handful didn't realize that the remainder had become tameh, and he offers the handful. Okay, he offers the handful. So now the question is, can the priests eat the remainder that became tameh? Does the tzitz not only affect acceptance for the owner of the offering, right? It's now a valid offering because the tzitz affected atonement for that handful that was burned. But can they also eat the remainder? Our Mishna said yes, they can eat the remainder because the tzitz essentially purified the whole offering, not only the handful, but even the remainder. But Rabbi Yosef says the front plate does not affect acceptance for the impurity of portions of offerings that are to be eaten. And the Gemara answers, you've got to reverse these opinions. Rabbi Eliezer says the front plate does not affect acceptance for the impurity of the portions of offerings that are to be eaten. And Rabbi Yosef says the front plate does affect acceptance for the impurity of portions of offerings that are to be eaten. Rav Sheshes objects to this reversal. And are you able to reverse the opinions and say that according to Rabbi Eliezer, the front plate does not affect acceptance for the impurity of portions that are to be eaten? But isn't it taught in the Baraisa, one might have thought that one who partakes of impure sacrificial meat, i.e. one who partakes of the meat while he himself is tameh, before the sprinkling of the blood takes place, is liable for eating it due to the violation of the prohibition against partaking of the meat while tameh. Now, the issue here is we're looking at an animal offering. Let's say that we're talking about a sin offering. So the animal is slaughtered, the blood is collected. There are portions of the sin offering, meat, the flesh, that are going to be burned on the altar. And there are portions of the flesh of that animal offering that are going to be eaten by the priest. When do the priests eat the edible portions? After the blood has been sprinkled. Can a priest be tameh when he's eating that meat? No. But if he's eating the meat while tameh before the blood has been sprinkled, then, interestingly enough, what he's doing is not eating. It doesn't fall under the definition of eating. Now, he's violated the prohibition of eating a sin offering, eating the meat of a sin offering before the blood has been sprinkled, but he's not liable, he's not guilty of eating the meat of an offering while tameh, because this meat is not technically the edible meat of an offering yet, because the blood hasn't been sprinkled yet. So if he's tameh when he eats that, he's premature in eating meat, but he's not going to be guilty of eating the meat of an offering while tameh, because this is not the meat of an offering that's edible yet, since the blood hasn't been sprinkled. Right? You might have thought that to counter this, the verse states, everyone that is ritually pure may eat of it. And immediately afterward, the verse states, but the soul that eats of the meat of the sacrifice of peace offerings that belong to the Lord, having his impurity upon him, that soul shall be cut off from his people. And the juxtaposition of these verses teaches that if one who is tameh, himself is tameh, partakes of that which has become permitted to those who are ritually pure, then he is liable for eating it due to violation of the prohibition against partaking of meat while tameh. But if one who is himself tameh partakes of that which is not permitted to those who are tahor, he is not liable for eating it due to the violation of the prohibition against partaking of meat while tameh. Since it is not permitted to eat the sacrificial meat before the sprinkling of the blood, one who partakes of it at that point is not liable to receive kares for eating it while tameh. He violated a different prohibition. He shouldn't be eating meat that has not been rendered permitted for eating before the blood was sprinkled. I don't think that's a kares-bearing penalty. But eating sacrificial meat while tameh is a kares-bearing penalty, and he's not guilty of that because this meat is not yet edible sacrificial portions of a sin offering or of a peace offering, for that matter. Now the Brisa continues, or perhaps is the verse teaching only, and that what I just said is the law, but or perhaps is the verse teaching only that if one who is tameh partakes of that which is eaten by those who are tahor, he is liable for eating it due to the violation of the prohibition against partaking of meat while tameh. But in a case where he partakes of that which is not eaten by those who are tahor, he is not liable for eating it due to the violation of the prohibition against partaking of the meat while tameh, despite the fact that the blood has already been sprinkled. I would then exclude sacrificial meat that was left overnight and the meat that leaves the temple courtyard, which are not permitted to be eaten by those who are tameh, who are tahor, who are ritually pure. And I would derive that one who is impure, who partakes of them, is not liable for eating them, right? There are different things that permit meat to be eaten by the priest. One thing is the blood has to be sprinkled on the altar. Another is that the meat never left the courtyard. So what they're saying is, well, maybe he won't be guilty of eating meat while tameh if it's meat that left the courtyard, but he would be guilty of eating it if the blood hadn't been sprinkled yet. They're going to say, no, that's not the law. Therefore, the verse states that belong to the Lord, which teaches that the verse included leftover meat that leaves the temple courtyard in the prohibition, and one who partakes of them while tameh is liable for partaking of them, but not if it's meat whose blood has not been sprinkled on the altar yet. One might have thought that I included in the prohibition the meat that was rendered piggul through one's intention of consuming it after its designated time, and meat that was rendered notar, not because he had an intention at the beginning, but because the meat was still left after its designated time and he ate it then. So what if he's tameh when he eats those things, meat that was piggul or meat that is tameh? Now meat that is piggul or meat that is notar, and he is tameh. So there, he already has a kares penalty for eating meat that is piggul or notar, and he does it intentionally. What if he's also tameh at that time? The Brisa interjects, isn't notar identical to meat that was left overnight? And it has already been established that one is liable for partaking of leftover meat while he is tameh? Rather, what is meant is as follows. One might have thought to include in the prohibition even the meats that were rendered piggul, just as notar is included. Therefore, the verse states, of the meat of the sacrifice of peace offerings, and the term of the meat comes to exclude one who is tameh and who partakes of piggul, right? Because there's two problems, right? With the compounded errors, which we talked about often. When there's compounding errors, you're actually not going to be guilty of both. Now, the Brisa asks, and what did you see to include these, i.e. leftover meat and meat that leaves the courtyard, and that somebody who's tameh eats those, he is liable for eating sacrificial meat while tameh? But why are you then excluding those, i.e. piggul? And the the Gemara answers, after the verse included some offerings and excluded others, you should say the following. I include these, the leftover meat and the meat that left the temple courtyard, as they had a period of fitness after the blood was sprinkled, before they were rendered unfit by being left over too long beyond the deadline or by leaving the temple courtyard. But I exclude those, i.e. piggul, as they never had a period of fitness, since the priest had in mind to eat the meat beyond its time when he was slaughtering the animal or when he was sprinkling the blood. From then on, this meat never had a period of fitness, and so if he ended up eating it while he was tameh, he violated piggul, but he didn't violate eating while tameh. So he's already got a kares-bearing penalty, but he's not going to have two. Now the Brisa concludes, and if you say that, if that is the case, then with regard to sacrificial meat that became tameh before the sprinkling of the blood, and one who himself was tameh ate it after the sprinkling of the blood, for what reason is he liable for eating it due to the violation of this prohibition against eating sacrificial meat while you yourself are tameh? it never had a period of fitness since it became tameh, that meat became tameh after the slaughter and before the blood was sprinkled. And the answer is that he is liable because the tzitz atones for the tuma of the meat, rendering it permitted. Then when he himself eats it while he is tameh, he now becomes guilty of the kares bearing prohibition of eating sacrificial meat while he is tameh. Now it arises from this baraisa that if the offering became tameh, then yes, the tzitz affects acceptance. But in the case of sacrificial meat that leaves the temple courtyard, the tzitz does not affect acceptance, which we said from the beginning. And therefore, it was never considered to have a period of fitness. So what about that? Rav Sheshes now states his question. Who did you hear who says that the sprinkling of the blood is not effective in the case of sacrificial meat that leaves the temple courtyard? This is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, as seen in Tractate Me'ilah. And yet, although this baraisa is then clearly in accordance with his opinion, it teaches that the tzitz affects acceptance for the tuma, the impurity of the portions of offerings that are to be eaten. Therefore, this too is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, and the opinions in the baraisa that was cited above should not be reversed, right? We said, we had a problem squaring Rabbi Yosef versus Rabbi Eliezer, so we'll reverse the opinions. But this was a long proof to show us that, well, no, that's not what, you can't reverse those opinions, because then you will end up ascribing to Rabbi Eliezer something that he definitely did not hold by. So rather, Rav Chisda said, we have a different solution. It is not difficult. This baraisa, which teaches that the tzitz affects acceptance for the tuma portions of offerings that are to be eaten, is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, whereas that baraisa, which teaches that the tzitz does not affect acceptance, is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. Not Rabbi Yosef, but the majority. The Gemara asks, you can say that you heard that Rabbi Eliezer holds that the tzitz affects acceptance for the impurity of the portions of offerings that are to be eaten, right? The meat became tameh, the blood was sprinkled anyway, the tzitz affects acceptance, and now those edible portions can be eaten because the tzitz is not only affecting acceptance, but basically purifying that meat that became tameh after it was slaughtered. But says the Gemara, did you hear him, Rabbi Eliezer, say that the sages did not penalize one who acted willfully? The Gemara says, yes, just as you heard that Rabbi Yosef holds with regard to teruma, the one who separated impure produce on behalf of pure produce is not penalized. You heard that Rabbi Eliezer holds the same. Holds the same. And this is as it is taught in Baraisa. Rabbi Eliezer says, whether one acted unwittingly or intentionally, his teruma is teruma. Gemara says, no. You can say that you heard Rabbi Eliezer state this law with regard to teruma, right? Teruma, which is part of the tithing process, it produces consecrated food, but it's not an offering. It doesn't go to the temple, right? A farmer who is a priest, a Kohen who lives in his town, he can take that first 2% of his produce, make sure it's tahor, and hand it to the priest who lives in his town, and only the priest can eat it because it's consecrated food, now only good for Kohanim to eat it, for priests to eat it. But still, the law of teruma is much more lenient than the law of sacrificial offerings, which are brought to the holy temple. Right? You can say that you heard Rabbi Eliezer state this law with regard to teruma, which is lenient. But did you hear him say this with regard to consecrated items, i.e. offerings, which are more severe? And the Gemara answers, if it is so that Rabbi Eliezer does not hold the same opinion with regard to consecrated items, to whom will you attribute this baraisa that rules that the sages did not penalize one who acted willfully? Rather, it must be that this is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Ravina said that the contradiction between the two baraisas should be resolved in a different way. With regard to the circumstances of the contraction of its tuma, that it became tameh, regardless of whether the blood was made tameh unwittingly or intentionally, the tzitz affects acceptance for the tuma, and the offering is accepted, as the second baraisa teaches. By contrast, with regard to the sprinkling of the blood, so I understood correctly originally, right? There's a difference in terms of intentionality of how the offering became tameh, whether that was on purpose or not, and whether the blood was sprinkled on the altar knowingly or unknowingly, like knowing or not knowing that the offering itself, the animal, had become tameh. Those are two different questions. How did the animal become tameh, and did the priest know of it at the time that he sprinkled the blood? Right? So by contrast, with regard to the sprinkling of the blood, if it was unwittingly sprinkled after becoming tameh, meaning that the priest was unaware that it was tameh, then the offering is accepted. But if it was intentionally sprinkled after becoming tameh, then it is not accepted, as the first baraisa teaches. And Rabbi Shela said the opposite resolution. With regard to the sprinkling of the blood, whether it was performed unwittingly or intentionally, the offering is accepted. By contrast, with regard to the circumstances of how it became tameh, if it was rendered tameh unwittingly, the offering is accepted. And if it was rendered impure intentionally, it is not accepted. It's almost like you can see how, okay, the priest was unaware that the offering had become tameh, and then he sprinkles unwittingly. Or the priest knew it had become tameh and he says, I'm going to sprinkle anyway. Okay. If it was a communal offering, it would be accepted. If not, he really did what he should not have done. He was acting cavalier. Maybe he made a mistake and he didn't want to cop to it, and then later he does cop to it, right? So in that situation where he sprinkled it knowing that the offering was tameh, the tzitz will not affect acceptance. It's interesting to ponder, how did the offering become tameh intentionally in the first place, right? That would be like a priest entered the temple knowing he was tameh and didn't want to tell anybody, and then he, slaughtered the animal. So now he's in contact with the animal after it's dead. He is tameh. He's going to render, the animal and the blood, if he's collecting the blood, he's going to render it tameh, right? And he did that intentionally. And then later he regrets what he did and he admits it to everybody else. And it's like, okay, the offering became tameh intentionally. Can the tzitz still atone for that? Right? Interesting question. Rabbi Shela would say that if it was rendered tameh intentionally, then the tzitz will not affect acceptance for it. But what we learned earlier is different, right? And I think that's the law, that the tzitz will atone as long as the priest sprinkled the blood unwittingly. The tzitz will atone even if the offering itself was rendered, or even the blood itself was rendered tameh intentionally. Now the Gemara explains, and according to Rav Shela, concerning that which is taught in the second baraisa, that the tzitz affects acceptance for blood that itself was rendered tameh, regardless of whether it happened unwittingly or intentionally, this is what it is saying. If the blood was rendered tameh unwittingly, and one sprinkled its blood, whether it was sprinkled unwittingly or intentionally, it is accepted. Now we're on 26a. If the Gemara, and then the Gemara suggests a refutation of Rav Shela's opinion based on the first baraisa that we covered tonight. Come in here, in the case of blood of an offering that became tameh, and the priest sprinkled it on the altar, if he did the sprinkling unwittingly, the offering is accepted and achieves atonement for the owner of the offering. If he sprinkled the blood intentionally, right, knowing it was tameh, then the offering is not accepted. And this contradicts Rav Shela's statement that even if the priest sprinkled the blood intentionally, it is accepted. And the Gemara rejects this proof. According to Rav Shela, this is what the Bryce is saying. In the case of blood that became tameh and a priest sprinkled it, whether it was sprinkled unwittingly or intentionally, was rendered impure unwittingly. If it was rendered impure unwittingly, it is accepted. But if it was rendered impure intentionally, then it is not accepted. That's Rav Shela's view. That's not the law. And there we conclude our discussion of Mishnah number 5. We move on to Mishnah 6. If after the handful was removed, the remainder of the meal offering became tameh, or if the remainder of the meal offering was burned, or if the remainder of the meal offering was lost, according to the principle of Rabbi Eliezer, who says that with regard to an animal offering, the blood is fit for sprinkling, and if there is no meat that can be eaten, the meal offering is fit, and the priest burns the handful. But according to the principle of Rabbi Yehoshua, who says that with regard to an animal offering, the blood is fit for sprinkling only if there is meat that can be eaten, it is unfit, and the priest does not burn the handful, as the handful serves to render permitted the remainder. So here we have two views of two individuals, and we're not sure yet what the law is, but we covered this concept in Zevachim, right, with animal offerings. So here, in terms of removing the handful from a meal offering, right, he removed the handful. At that time, everything was fine. Then the remainder, which is waiting for the handful to be burned, and then it becomes edible to the priests, or if it's a different kind of meal offering, it might even be edible to the owner. But that remainder can only be eaten after the handful is burned. Okay, but what happens if the remainder is destroyed, or it's lost, or all of it is rendered tameh before the handful is burned? There is nothing left to be eaten. Do we still burn the handful? Right? So according to one view, yes. It doesn't matter whether all of it's destroyed, you still burn the handful. And according to the other view, no. Unless there's at least a little bit left of the animal, or here, unless there's a little bit left of the remainder of the meal offering, we don't burn the handful. Right, so Rabbi Eliezer says, even if all of the remainder is destroyed or lost, we can still burn the handful. Rabbi Yehoshua says, no, there has to be some of that remainder left, or you cannot burn the handful. That's Mishnah 6. Now the Gemara. With regard to the Mishnah's statement that according to Rabbi Yehoshua, the meal offering is unfit if its remainder is rendered tameh, right? All the remainder is tameh, so therefore you cannot burn the handful. About this, Rav says, and this is the law only when all of its remainder became tameh. But if only a part of its remainder became tameh, then the meal offering is not unfit. Okay, if some of the remainder became unfit for eating, became tameh, but some of it is still fit, you can burn the handful. It's only if all of it is lost, all of it is destroyed, or all of it is rendered tameh, and that it would be that the handful cannot be burned. Now, the Gemara comments, it enters your mind that Rav holds that only if a part of the remainder became tameh, then yes, the meal offering is fit. But if part of the remainder was lost or burned, then the meal offering is not fit. Like you might have thought. He said, okay, lost or destroyed. He didn't address that. He just said if some is tameh and some is not, we can still burn the handful. Does that imply that if some is lost or destroyed, we don't burn the handful? Or are we going to learn out? No. It's only if all of it is lost or all of it is destroyed that we don't burn the handful. The Gemara asks, what does Rav hold? If he holds that that what remains is significant, so that even if a portion of the remainder cannot be eaten, but some of it can be eaten, the handful is still sacrificed to render the rest permitted, then why would this not also be the law even if part of the remainder was lost or burned? So alternatively, if he holds that what remains is not significant, and right away the Gemara interjects, and accordingly, what is the reason that the handful is sacrificed if a part of the remainder became tameh? It is because the tzitz affects acceptance for the impurity. If that is so, then even if all the remainder became tameh, the handful should still be sacrificed. So the Gemara explains, actually, he holds that what remains is significant. Right? So in other words, even though you lost some or most of the remainder, as long as you've got, a minimum amount, we consider that significant, and therefore you've got enough left so that it justifies burning the handful so that they can then eat this significant amount of the remainder of the offering. And therefore, you're justified to burn the handful. Right, so let me read that again. So actually holds that what remains is significant. And just as when a part of the remainder became tameh, but the offering is still fit, the rest of the remainder is sacrificed. The same is true with regard, that would be the handful, the same is true with regard to a case where a part of the remainder was lost or burned. And the reason that he stated the law specifically in a case where it became tameh is that he employed the terminology of the beginning of the Mishnah, which discusses a case where the remainder became tameh. He's not saying that if part of it became tameh, you could still sacrifice the handful, and if part became lost or burned, you could still sacrifice the handful. He's not trying to imply that if part of the remainder became lost or burned, you don't sacrifice the handful. Rava's statement accords with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua. As it is taught in the Baraisa, the Rabbi Yehoshua says, with regard to all the offerings in the Torah, from which there remains an olive bulk of meat, animal offerings, that is fit to be eaten, or an olive bulk of fat that is fit to be sacrificed on the altar, as long as you've got at least an olive bulk left of that animal, the priest sprinkles the blood, right? Because after you slaughtered the animal, collected the blood, the priest is on his way to sprinkle the blood, and then something happened. A bomb fell, God forbid, and the animal was blown up, or the animal burned up, or thieves came and carried away the animal, right? Lost would be it's gone. Destroyed means destroyed. And rendered tameh means, rendered impure. So as long as an olive bulk of that animal remains, the priest that's taking the blood to be sprinkled on the altar can still sprinkle. So likewise with a meal offering, as long as, maybe an olive bulk or some minimum measure of the meal offering remains, the remainder remains, then the handful can be burned. Rav's statement, I just read that. Okay, so the Gemara cites the continuation of the Baraisa. If all that remains is half an olive bulk of meat and half an olive bulk of fat, the priest does not sprinkle the blood because we're not going to combine what is edible by the priest with what is to be burned on the altar. Right? This is because the half bulk of meat and the half bulk olive bulk of fat do not combine to form one olive bulk, since the former is eaten and the latter is sacrificed on the altar. But contrast that with the remainder of meal offering, all of which is eaten, right? So, there's not two categories here. And with regard to a burnt offering, even if all that was left was half an olive bulk of meat and half an olive bulk of fat, then the priest does sprinkle the blood, because with a burnt offering, everything that remains is going to be burned on the altar, whether it's meat or fat. Fat, we're talking about the prohibited fat that can only be burned on the altar, that can't be eaten by people. Because it is consumed on the altar in its entirety. Since both the meat and the fat are sacrificed on the altar, you can combine half minimum measures together to form the minimum measure, and then you would sprinkle the blood. And with regard to a meal offering, although all of it remains pure, the priest shall not sprinkle the blood. What? Why are we talking about meal offerings and say if all of it remains pure? Are we talking about tuma here? If it didn't become tameh, why would we not sprinkle it? Well, why are we even talking about sprinkling the blood? Sprinkling the blood. Because we saw this before. We're talking about sprinkling the blood. So this meal offering is not a meal offering brought by itself. This meal offering is a meal offering that accompanies an animal offering, right? So if the animal itself became destroyed, but the meal offering remained and was still pure, you might have thought that you can still sprinkle the blood on behalf of the meal offering that accompanied the animal offering, right? No. The meal offering doesn't substitute for the animal in the question of do we sprinkle the blood. Right, the Gemara questions the last ruling of the Baraisa. What is the mention of a meal offering doing here? The discussion is about sprinkling blood, which is not relevant in the case of a meal offering. And Rav Papa said the meal offering mentioned is the meal offering that accompanies the libations that accompany animal offerings. It could enter your mind to say, since this meal offering accompanies the animal offering, it is comparable to the offering itself, and therefore the offering became tameh, but the meal offering remained tahor, pure, the blood of the offering is still sprinkled due to the remaining meal offering. To counter this, the Baraisa teaches us that this is not the law. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Now the Gemara returns to its discussion of the law that if only an olive bulk of the fat remains, the priest sprinkles the blood of the offering. From where is this matter derived? Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, and there are those who determine that it was said in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah. The verse states, and the priest shall sprinkle the blood against the altar of the Lord at the door of the tent of meeting, and he shall make the fat smoke for a pleasing aroma to the Lord. This verse never mentions the meat, but only the fat, indicating that the blood is sprinkled even if there is no ritually pure meat, but only fat. And the Gemara asks, and we found a source for the law that the priest sprinkles the blood if only fat remains. From where do we derive that the priest sprinkles the blood if all that is left is the lobe of the liver or the 2 kidneys, which are also sacrificed on the altar? Gemara answers, the law that the priest sprinkles the blood in that case is derived from that which is taught at the end of the Baraisa. With regard to a meal offering, although all of it remains pure, the priest shall not sprinkle the blood. This teaches that it is in the case of a meal offering that the priest shall not sprinkle the blood, as the meal offering is not part of the animal. But if a part of the animal remains, like the lobe of the liver or the 2 kidneys, then the priest will sprinkle the blood. This would be as opposed to if the whole animal disappears. According to the view of Rabbi Yehoshua, if the whole animal disappears after it was slaughtered and before the blood was sprinkled, according to Rabbi Eliezer, they would still sprinkle the blood. Gemara asks, from where do we derive this law? And the Gemara answers that Rabbi Yochanan himself says. The verse states, for a pleasing aroma to the Lord. This teaches that the blood is sprinkled whenever anything that you offer up on the altar for a pleasing aroma remains. This includes anything that is burned on the altar. What is burned on the altar for an animal offering? The meat. Right? Any of the organs, any part that is actually burned on the altar, as long as you have at least an olive bulk of that, you can sprinkle the blood. The Gemara notes, and it was necessary to write fat in that verse, and it was necessary to write for a pleasing aroma. As if the merciful one had written only fat, I would say that if fat remains, yes, the priest sprinkles the blood, but if only the lobe of the liver, the 2 kidneys remain, since they are not as significant as the fat, the blood is not sprinkled. Therefore, the merciful one wrote for a pleasing aroma. And if the merciful one had written only for a pleasing aroma, I would say that it includes even a meal offering brought with the libations that accompany animal offerings. Therefore, the merciful one wrote fat, to teach that this law applies only to sacrificial parts of the animal, but not to accompanying libations and meal offerings. Even if you had libations and meal offerings that were still there, if the animal was totally destroyed or totally lost, you would not sprinkle the blood. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 6. We'll pick it up tomorrow with Mishnah 7. One comment from Lucy. It looks like maybe different priests could do the different parts of the sacrificial ritual. Exactly. Hence, you could have unrelated intention mistakes, right? Mistakes about intentionality, for example, at different parts of the ritual, or a lack of awareness of what someone else did. Hence, the odd combination of errors at times. Exactly. Just so, Lucy, you understood it and explained it very well. Thank you. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, see you tomorrow, Wednesday, regular Wednesday time.